Hello again. I spoke yesterday about one of the effects of immigration in Britain in the last few decades, the loss of gardens. I want to think today in broader terms and so look generally at one typical town with which I am very familiar. In the 19th century, Ilford was an Essex village about 7 miles from the centre of London. As late as 1965, the postal address was still Ilford, Essex. Today, it is invariably described on the news as being part of East London. It's been swallowed up by the encroaching suburbs. In the 1960s and 1970s, the worst that one could say of the town was that it was very dull. Nothing much happened in Ilford. It was, until the early 1970s, 100% white. One simply did not see black people there, and only the very occasional person of South Asian origin. It was a neat, quiet and orderly place. There were two very good grammar schools nearby which somehow survived the comprehensive experiment, Ilford County High for boys and Woodford County High for girls, and they both took pupils from Ilford who passed their 11 plus. They too were 100% white. Ilford had in those days a distinctive character. The town hall looked like something from a South American republic, extraordinary building, and there were old-fashioned department stores. One was called Bodger's and the other West's. There was also a really quaint indoor market called the Pioneer Market, where one could buy wool for knitting, gramophone records, fresh fish, all sorts of things. Ilford in those days was a distinct entity. It had a character. There was no violence. The last murder anybody living there could really recall was the case of Edith Thompson and Freddie Bywaters, in which Mrs. Thompson's husband was murdered, for which crime she and her lover were hanged. This took place in Belgrave Road in 1922. Imagine somebody being stabbed to death in Ilford, we used to think. 50 years later, it was still a shocking thought. 1960s, 1970s, no one was ever stabbed in Ilford. It was a bizarre idea. There was nothing remarkable about Ilford. It was typical of England as a whole. Then things began to change, slowly at first, but then with breakneck speed and dizzying rapidity. To begin with, a few Sikhs began to settle in nearby Seven Kings, for those who didn't know the area, chiefly along Pembroke Road. Nobody cared about that because they were law-abiding and industrious. Then Gujarati Hindus began to arrive, and parts of Seven Kings and then Ilford began to look more Indian than they did English. The shops began to change. Even so, Ilford itself retained its identity. Towards the turn of the millennium, though, everything began to change catastrophically. It was at this time that the white English people living in Ilford suddenly realised they were becoming a minority in their own town. Most people had accepted the small Asian community, but now when anybody talked of the changes in the town, they were accused of racism. Between 2000 and 2020, the population of Ilford increased by 25%. That's about 80,000 extra people, almost all of them born abroad. In the description to this video, I give a link to the population statistics for the town during that time. The birth rate soared from 3,500 a year to over 6,000 a year. Nearly all these births were to foreign mothers. Deaths in the same period fell, with the result that the town was now bursting at the seams. Gardens were built over to provide extra housing, but that didn't really solve the problem because more and more people were coming. The new residents didn't want old-fashioned department stores or indoor markets. Bodger's, which had been a landmark in the town for a century, closed down and was then demolished. A 42-story tower block is now being built on the site. The old indoor market closed down and 2 tower blocks were built there to house the tens of thousands of people moving into the area. The thumbnail to this video shows the skyscrapers on the site of the old Pioneer Market. Some of us remember the 1980s and 1990s when all the tower blocks in London were being demolished. It was a great event. They were dynamited and people used to go there for a day out to watch them being demolished. Nobody liked the tower blocks. They were absolutely awful. In places like Ilford, though, they are now making a big comeback to house all the immigrants who are still flocking to the town. The local Sainsbury's, only a stone's throw from what was the Pioneer Market, is being knocked down, and a lot of tower blocks are to be built on the site with room for 1,000 new families. The most depressing thing is that with all these tower blocks and skyscrapers, Ilford now looks like any random city anywhere in the world. It could be Chicago, Shanghai or Saudi Arabia. It now has no character whatsoever. The two grammar schools have no white pupils at all. They are literally 100% devoted to visible minorities these days. Don't even get me started on the stabbings and other murders, the prostitution run by Eastern Europeans, and the shantytown of homeless foreigners which has sprung up behind the high road. As I said at the beginning, there was, and still is, not anything at all remarkable about Ilford. It is typical of what has happened across the whole of England. Anything distinctly English is being knocked down and replaced by generic architecture, which is being used to house the millions of foreigners who have moved to the country. This is not, to say the least of it, an enticing prospect for the country's future.